Okay. Well, we waited 10 minutes. More or less okay. I will give a slow introduction to respect the academic quarter of being late. For this fourth session of the lecture series, which will deal mainly with the European border surveillance system, Eurosur. Now we have two speakers with two different profiles, and that prefigures a good debate. You know that the idea is that we have rather short presentations, two presentations of half an hour, 40 minutes, with after that quite some time left for discussion. But the first speaker will be Oliver Seiffarth. He is a policy officer for the European border surveillance system in the European Commission, and that's since February 2007. Until June 2008, he has also been responsible for the programming of the external borders fund. But formerly, Mr. Seiffarth worked at the EC around issues as Schengen and Frontex, but I think more from a financial position, but you were very close to these developments. And before that, and that is very important to know, Oliver worked also for different ministries of interior and in many different countries. He has been a hopper. He worked in the Ministry for Interior of Poland, of Slovenia, of Slovakia, and also in Austria. And this always on issues related to migration and visa policies. Before that, again, a different kind of life, I would say. He worked in a number of NGOs, including Amnesty International and Caritas. And that makes him a speaker with a very interesting profile. He worked on both sides of the coin, in NGOs, in ministries of interior. And he told me that he is open to any questions in this regard, also to critical questions. It's a little bit an ambiguous position, so maybe it's interesting to ask him ambiguous questions. So that's something he invites to. But the question should be clear, but the tendency might be a bit ambiguous. Okay. The second speaker is Julien Jeandesboz. He is a researcher at the Centre d'études sur les conflits in Paris. A research center that is led by Didier Bigot, who was here 2 weeks ago. Julien Jeandesboz is participating to a project, a European project in the framework 7 program on internal and external security. This INEX project is an internationally networked project where the continuum between internal security and external security is studied. We are implied in this project as well with Gloria, who's sitting there. Julien is also a PhD researcher at Sciences Po in Paris, a visiting researcher at the University of Kent, Brussels School of International Studies, and he is a member of a research network called Critical Approaches to Security in Europe. That announces another type of voice, but we don't know. We will listen to the two speakers. Julien is focusing in his research on issues pertaining to security policies, and he lies an emphasis on European border control and surveillance techniques. He is also interested into the relation between technologies on the one hand and security on the other hand. Okay, so we have two excellent speakers with very promising references. I think you agreed that Oliver would speak first. Okay, please have the floor.
Good afternoon. It's interesting for me to be here because all the presentations, this presentation usually I make it either in front of industry or in front of a number of border guards sitting there. So as I said, I'm really curious also for the discussion. I will try to talk not too long. Please don't hesitate to ask any kind of questions. What is migration? When we talk about migration, let's talk about what kind of terminology is being used. Migrant is relatively neutral. We talk in the EU about a third country national, which is in fact a very, I would say, a bad term somehow. And when we look not at the EU level, but when we look at member states level, then we have acts on aliens, legal acts on foreigners, which in fact alien, foreign has already some kind of negative meaning. And that's a bit with migration also, I think, a bit a pity that it's a very emotional topic. It's a topic where everybody has an opinion about, even when not really knowing much about it. And where this opinion, I would guess that maybe here the opinion in this room is at least 80–90% positive towards migration. But when you go out onto the street, you will have rather 80% being saying, migration, illegal migration, and we don't want this. So this is a bit what I, having worked quite since '91, in fact, in this field, and I was not expecting that time that it would become a life topic for me, but it happened, and I don't regret it. There are always so many emotions in this, and I think we should leave a bit the emotions aside and look simply a bit at the facts. So a bit the question of this series, I understood, is migration a threat to the EU? And when we just look a bit more from a different point of view, this is the UN Human Development Report 2009, which was published on October the 5th, just showing here the different migration flows around the world. And what is interesting simply, when people have always in their mind these pictures of boats full with illegal migrants, like it would be an invasion. But when you look at it, well, there are quite a lot of migrants in the world. We have 6.8 billion people today. We have about 1 billion who are migrating. But out of this, about 1 billion, more than 3/4, 740 million, are internal migrants, which is 4 times the number of so-called international migrants, which are only about 200 million, which is just 3% of the world population, and which in fact this percentage, 3%, has not changed since the 1960s. We are growing, of course, the total number is growing because the population in the world is growing, but it was always about 3%. And of this 200 million, only about 30% are moving from developing to developed countries. So the question here, whether it's really a threat for the time being, it can be really big questions. I would say rather not. I think it's an issue one could cope with. When we look at it a bit from a different point of view, it's a bit far away, but you have also here some copies. This is also from this UN report. What is interesting when we look about the demographic development, 2010 till 2050, the forecast. We have the different regions in the world which are more and more competing with each other, competing for natural resources, but also competing for human resources. We have North America, the United States had 200 million people in the 60s, recently surpassed 300 million. We have the European Union growing bigger and bigger, but when you look here at this slide, it's a bit far away, I think it's very interesting to look into the middle. When you look, there are some very small arrows going up, in fact, in 5 out of the 6 regions in the world. meaning that the working age population till 2050 in all these regions will go up either considerably or even a lot, like in Africa by 125%. When you look at the European Union, when you look at Europe, it's the only region in the world where it will go down. It's really the only one. And this is also even more drastic. It's from 2005, some UN forecast. At that time, the world about 6.5 billion people, Europe 730 million, including Russia, Ukraine, and so on. And when we had they made a number of forecasts, and I took here only the low forecast and the high forecast. Low forecast means no immigration, and we continue with the birth rate we have today. Then in that case, we go down quite drastically from 730 million today to 560 million in Europe. Whereas in all the other regions, for instance Africa, which is close by, it almost doubles. When you look at the high forecast, which is assuming that we take in a lot of legal migrants, much more than we do today, much more in this, according to this study, and we also try to have a higher birth rate in general, even then we will just be able to stabilize our population. Where again, when you look at Africa under the same scenario, it will triple. So it's not an issue which will pass by. Migration will be an issue where we are just at the very beginning. And also here, when we look a bit on our own interests, I hope we will all be still alive in 2050. Some of us will probably already be retired, or maybe not, because all the retirement age will be postponed. But we should think a bit ahead. When you just try to get some, I'm now drifting maybe a bit away from the topic, but I traveled to China several times over 20 years. And when you read there a bit from Chinese authors how they are seeing the future, they are thinking in terms of 20, 30, 40 years. What we are doing in Europe today, we are thinking short term. We don't even think midterm anymore. We just go really from one year to the next year, from one election to the next election. But we don't have any strategic forward thinking in our own interest. And if we just would look at this, it's very simple. We need legal immigration, much more than we have it today. In fact, we have to secure our own social systems. But in fact, the way it is seen, it's a bit different. What is the image of migration? As I said, we ask someone in the street, what is migration? First idea of the people will be illegal immigration. Here you see the different routes into the EU. What is interesting here is that the main migration routes in the 90s and also at the beginning of this decade was from the east, eastern land borders, just moving up and down there. The new member states made quite a lot of efforts when preparing for joining the European Union and in particular Schengen, and this is why I was working in these countries. Just changing, adapting legislation, IT systems, training of personnel and so on. And they did it quite well, which meant that as of 2004, 2005, migration flow was moving mainly to the south. First, more Canary Islands, 2004, 2005, 6. Now, main pressure is in the central Mediterranean. Lampedusa is in the media all the time. We see it now moving to the eastern Mediterranean. And when Romania and Bulgaria will join Schengen probably in 2011, we can be sure that migration flows will go through the Black Sea and even more through Greece than it is already today. What is also interesting for me is that when I worked in Slovenia, we had quite a huge influx of Iranians coming via Sarajevo. That time they didn't need visas because the Iranians had delivered quite a lot of weapons during the war in Yugoslavia to the Bosnian side. In return, the Bosnians didn't want to request visas from the Iranians. So they were flying in with big jumbo jets, 300 people from Tehran to Sarajevo, and they were flying back empty. And they were all just moving up to Slovenia. That time when I was in April, when it started, figures were going up. Slovenia, small country, 2 million people. several hundreds of them arriving per month. In July it was several thousands, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 per month, most of them applying for asylum, but not having any intention to stay in Slovenia, of course. And what was just the point why I'm telling this is, I was telling this to my boss in Vienna, which is, I worked at that time, I was seconded from the Austrian Ministry of Interior. My boss first didn't care. It's the neighboring country, it's Slovenia. If they have a problem, it's their problem, not mine. Until these people were, of course, moving to Austria to go to the US Embassy in Vienna, which had a special program for Christians coming from Iran and so on. It took us, in fact, 6 months to bring all the countries, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Austria, Germany, together and to agree on some measures. Once these measures were agreed, the migration flow, and that was the interesting thing, was moving within 4 weeks. The traffickers had totally rearranged the route, and the whole route was going via Belgrade up to Hungary. Then the same thing happened again. It took us, at that time we were a bit faster, but not as quick as traffickers. Then it went up to Slovakia, where I was working afterwards. So it was, traffickers are very, very flexible. And let's be honest, most of these migrants are coming with traffickers because, of course, it's getting more and more difficult to get into the European Union. But when I worked for NGOs, it was, for me also, it was, I was thinking that these people are spending 4, 6, 8, 10, 15,000 euros, which is a hell of a lot of money in the places where they come from. They are not the poorest of the poor, the ones who are coming. They are usually, I would say from my experience, upper middle class, who simply do not see a perspective in their own country, who just want to achieve something in their life. That time when I worked at NGOs, I was saying, but these were the people who were making the United States a great country. This kind of people were in former times moving from Europe to the United States. But these people, in fact, with this money they had, the whole clan at home was putting this money together, the trafficker putting a lot of pressure on their people at home because they are very well connected, at the same time exploiting them here. And when I worked at Caritas, we had some homes where we were putting these people, they were still writing down or calling down, saying, oh, here it's wonderful, here it's perfect, while they were in big, big trouble here. They were living on the street, minus 10 degrees outside, hungry, freezing, no perspective. But still keeping up this image that this here in Europe is really the place where to go. Some of them make it at the end, but many don't. And some of them come with very wrong expectations, but they still keep up this kind of image that this here is a bit of some kind of paradise, because it's also promoted by traffickers. And then, of course, they move on. When I was going the first time to the Austrian Asylum Office, working for NGOs, and I was very angry because I was accompanying 2 people from Iraq who were applying for asylum, and the officer in charge, he only wanted to know about the route they were coming. He was not really interested at all what the reasons were. So 1 hour interview about the route, 10 minutes about the reasons. Pure formality. I was very angry. I was really like writing a lot of appeals until I realized also that after 10 days, 100% of all these Iraqis coming at that time were moving on to Germany. So there are certain mechanisms behind which require a deeper look. But maybe I'm going a bit away from the topic. But I just also a bit of introduction to the issue. What is the main challenge we are facing today? We had in the beginning of the decades, maybe you remember, there were some big vessels coming, end-of-life vessels with 600-800 people on board going to the Italian-French coast. This we got more under control because it's much easier now to monitor and to track big vessels. So since 2004-2005 we are facing a new method. The use of small wooden boats, cayucos, which are definitely not high seagoing, which are usually totally overcrowded, and which are, that's why they do it, very difficult to track. But this is really, let's say, from the technological point of view, extremely difficult to do. What also happens here is, well, what is the tragic part here, that it's nobody can say how many of them are losing their lives. There are about 1,000 dead bodies washed ashore on the coast, but I was reading once a statement from the International Red Cross that, taking into account the sea currents, for instance, off the Canary Islands, where boats, when they don't make it to the Canary Islands, they get into the Gulf Stream, and then already these boats have arrived at Barbados, with the people still inside but more mummified. That about 2/3 of them simply disappear in the sea, and only one third are really found dead off the shore. So you in fact could also triple this number. So it's between, I would estimate, between 1,000 and 3,000 per year who die at our borders, our maritime borders. At land borders, the number is a few dozens who are freezing to death in winter, who are, when crossing some rivers, go into the cold water and then simply don't make it. It's a very low number. But still, this number is 10 times as high as, for instance, at the US-Mexican border, where it's estimated to be between 200 and 300 per year. And this is a number which is totally unacceptable. I mean, this is like a small war in casualty terms. That's really something, I think, something where we should do something about it. But these migration routes are not only, used for illegal migration. They're also used for cross-border crime, such as narcotics trafficking in human beings, contraband, and so on. So what happens sometimes that the traffickers are sending boat with illegal immigrants out into the sea. Then these migrants, what happens now more and more, that they have a mobile phone, and then they call, so to say, Frontex, joint operations, please pick us up. Sometimes not really well equipped enough that you can localize them that easily. What also happened with these boats in the beginning, that when they were seeing, being in this cayuco, they saw a patrol boat passing by, they started destroying their own boat to make it a search and rescue case, which on the high seas always has top priority over anything else. And then until this patrol boat, which of course takes some time, has arrived, many of them were drowning already. What happened also that is, in the beginning, that the patrol boat was coming, so to say, from the side, close slowly to this cayuco, and all the people in the cayuco were just all at the same time going trying to get onto the patrol boat. So the cayuco was turning around and they were drowning again. So what they do now in the Frontex joint operations, that they wait very often for a second boat, and then they come from both sides and they stabilize the cayuco before they tell the people to get off the boat. But of course, when it's high sea, when the seas are rough, it is extremely difficult. And the problem is now that whereas there was a migration season, so to say, in summertime, now the migration season turns out to be around the whole of the year, and people are really now, they are going at times where where fishermen know you shouldn't go out there with these small boats. But what also happens is that they send a boat with a cayuco with these illegal immigrants. They make it a search and rescue case, which has priority, as I said, over everything else. And then they send the speedboats, 1, 2, 3, 4, with trucks just after it. So the patrol is bound to deal with rescuing the lives, and the well-organized drug boats go through. What United States is now facing is that they got a bit under control these small planes with the drugs, which was a problem in the 80s. Small planes flying into US, delivering drugs. We have this now a bit starting in the south of Spain. While they also got under control the small boats to some extent, in close cooperation with the Caribbean countries. But now they are facing a problem of semi-submersibles, which are home-built submarines, which are built by the Colombian drug mafia, which doesn't simply want to share the profits with the Mexican drug mafia by going via the land route. but they are building themselves, and there's intelligence that up to 30 of these home-built submarines are under construction at any given time, which then go off the Pacific coast up to 300,000 nautical miles, and then the drugs are transported into California with speedboats. This is something which also still will come to Europe. It has not really happened yet, but whenever there are new means and tools to be found, they will be used. So I would say the other side is even more innovative in finding new methods than we are. How did Europe respond? Of course, you could say, well, the response was Schengen. When you look at Schengen, maybe in the old member states, the image is a different one than in the new member states. I don't like so much the term enlargement of the EU, because by taking in 10 countries of the Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm from Vienna, so rather close to them, I think it's some kind of reunification. And I have experienced myself, and it was also one of my driving motivation behind, how important it was for these people who lived behind the Iron Curtain that the borders to the old member states have been abolished in December 2007. That was a moment for many people which was much more than joining the European Union. And this we should not forget. So what we have now, we have an area of more than 400 million people in the Schengen area, where you can travel freely and hopefully also work freely until the labor market restrictions are hopefully lifted soon. But this I think is quite a major achievement. The next step, however, Schengen is a concept which was developed, you probably know already, in '85. And we are coming a bit to the end, I dare to say, slowly with Schengen. And the next step is integrated border management. Something everybody likes to talk about, but it's more a concept, it doesn't really exist yet, which consists of a number of elements. According to the Schengen Borders Code, we have on the one hand, we have border checks, which are done at border crossing points, airports, seaports, road crossings, railway crossings. We have border surveillance, which is in between the border crossing points, so the blue border in the maritime field, the green border land. And what is also becoming more and more important, which is sometimes requires some retraining of border guards, is in fact risk analysis and crime intelligence, to really include this. And also to combine this, that's not really visible here, cooperation with neighboring third countries. So that's the first element where we are making quite good progress. So Frontex is doing risk analysis, is starting a bit together with Europol now on crime intelligence. The other part, and this will be with the entry of the force of the Treaty of Lisbon become more important, which is for the time being still third pillar, but which will become first pillar, is the detection and investigation of cross-border crime. Then we have the Schengen Frontiers model. So border control is only to some extent done really at the border, but in fact it starts with visa policy measures in third countries, cooperation then with neighboring countries, the border control in itself, but also inland control measures. The main topic, I think, for the coming years will be interagency cooperation. How to overcome this competitive nature between border guards and customs, but also how to have an intelligence cooperation, at least between border guards and police and so on. And this hopefully should, in the coming years, result in some real integrated border management. Finally, of course, also in coordination and coherence with other activities of the EU. But this is a bit the dream we still have, which is accepted as a principle, but not really very far in reality. We had to do something, on the other hand, rather quickly, in particular in the Mediterranean, when Frontex started working in 2005. And that's the so-called European Patrols Network. A great name. Maybe the name is bigger than it is really doing in reality. But the idea is to set up so-called national coordination centers in each of the countries in the Mediterranean, but also in the Black Sea. By this, there was a BORTEC study by Frontex and the MEDSEA study in 2006-2007, which has shown that alone in the 8 countries forming the southern border of the EU, starting from Portugal going to Cyprus, about 43 authorities are involved somehow in border surveillance, meaning it's usually 6-7 different authorities per country directly involved. If you count it indirectly, I would say it's about 70. And these authorities, how to bring them together, it's very, very difficult, because they are just safeguarding their competences. For instance, Italy, Coast Guard, is responsible for search and rescue. But then you have the Italian Navy, which is responsible for everything beyond 24 nautical miles, and so on and so on. So to bring this together is very difficult. That's why the idea of these national coordination centers. And also to avoid that you have, for instance, on the French side, you have a ship patrolling next to the Italian border, and by coincidence you have just, if here's the border, you just have on the Italian side also a ship. So to coordinate this, it sounds more logic and easier than it is, because member states are very sensitive about their sovereign rights here. And in addition, we have the so-called Frontex joint operations, which are more off third country coasts. I can then say more about it maybe later on. And that's just the European Patrols Network, that's so to say short term, and it's focused on the reaction capability. Whereas Eurosur, it's more long term, it's more strategic, and it includes even more to have also all aspects of situational awareness. And there we are. I go now, it becomes now a bit more technical. What are the objectives of Eurosur? Eurosur is there to support member states' authorities in improving their situational awareness at their borders. So simply knowing much more what is going on at this border, because sometimes they don't know as well as they should, but also to increase their reaction capabilities by having a bit more unity of effort between the different services. With 3 aims. Of course, first to combat illegal immigration. Secondly, to considerably reduce the number of migrants drowning in the sea. And as I mentioned, it's not only about illegal immigration, it's also about drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and so on. So thereby to increase the internal security of the EU as a whole by preventing cross-border crime. What is the approach? That's a bit untypical for the Commission. Normally the European Commission comes up with legislation and then we implement. And sometimes the implementation doesn't go so well as we thought. Here the approach was the other way around. We were proposing in a communication in February 2008 some kind of roadmap with 3 different phases, 8 different steps. And we wanted to see first what is the political willingness of member states. We didn't really expect that the member states were saying that the Council would say take it all, but the Council did so in June 2008. And since that time we are now in a definition phase. We have a number of studies going on, technical studies. We have an expert group with member states, with a number of expert groups in fact. And we are just trying to find out what can be done from a technical point of view. And then only at the end we will come up with the legislation once we have agreed between member states and Frontex what we want to do. Eurosur is not really a system, it's rather a system of systems, or so-called, I called it a technical framework for the use of already existing systems. We don't want to set up something new again, and also certain tools like satellites which are less expensive to be used at EU level. And it should allow the exchange of information, but also of intelligence. The backbone are these so-called national coordination centers. The stronger they are, the better Eurosur will work. At the same time, we are totally neutral with regard to the internal division of member states. It's just every member state is structured in a different way. We are not going to streamline this. It's not our business in the European Commission. So there it's very difficult to find the right balance between creating something efficient, but also not interfering into national competences. As I said, 3 phases, 8 steps, which are interlinked, but the idea is that in case one step fails or is delayed, it doesn't endanger the whole project. And finally, the implementation should be done by member states. Big industry doesn't like this. They're always dreaming of a big super contract for one big super system for billions of euros. This will not happen. We want it will be done by the member states, by national tendering, with funding from the External Border Fund, and some elements will be done at EU level, for instance, by Frontex. What are the 3 phases of Eurosur? Phase 1 is focusing on the national level. Theoretically, in Schengen, all the member states are doing the same job at their borders. Practically, there are differences. Some are more advanced. France has set up the SPACIONAV system, a very integrated system. Some other countries have still a number of surveillance systems in parallel, not really integrated with each other, not really communicating with each other. So we want here to have a bit more upgrading in some member states at technical level. Phase 2, what could be done at EU level when with community funding, to have, as I mentioned, tools such as satellites and to use them in a coherent way. And phase 3, there will be a communication tomorrow adopted by the Commission. It will be public on Thursday on towards the creation of a common information sharing environment for the EU maritime domain. I will go now more into detail in each of these phases. Phase 1, what should be done at EU level?
I think I speak loud enough. It's what? Ah, yeah, the camera. Okay. You see here, so to say, the EU Schengen area. You have here the southern maritime borders, and you have the eastern land borders. So, in phase 1, step 1 is setting up a single national coordination center per country, which coordinates the surveillance activities of all national authorities, hopefully including the military, which is a very difficult topic, and also then having one surveillance system. Then these different national coordination centers, they should be interconnected in a secure communication network, and we will start with a pilot project next year to do this with each other, but also with Frontex. And of course, it would be useful to have such an infrastructure also in the neighboring third countries, in particular in the Northern African and Western African coasts, that you simply have somebody to talk to, that the French National Coordination Center can simply call the National Coordination Center in Algiers, and they can coordinate their activities.
What have we been doing so far? We have used the External Border Fund to start with the setting up of these national coordination centers and national surveillance systems. In fact, all the 18 countries concerned, all the 18 member states concerned have put this into their programming. We are working since last year on guidelines for the tasks of and the cooperation between these national coordination centers, so how they should work together, which kind of information should be exchanged when, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, in real time. And Frontex is also carrying out a number of studies. They just have been in September to Senegal and to Moldova to analyze the existing and needed border surveillance infrastructure. And we have a number of technical studies going on. We have, in fact, experienced in the previous years that big industry is sometimes very successful in selling to member states surveillance systems which are totally exaggerated, totally overpaid, and, well, I don't say more because I don't want to be quoted, but you know, whenever there's big money, maybe there might be some kickback. So we are now trying, what we did is in these technical studies that we were taking the whole EU external border and we go by so-called border segments. A border segment is not a border section, but it can be simply 20 kilometers off the external borders, flat land, no trees, good visibility. It could be also 20 kilometers of a land border, mountainous area with a lot of woods, or Greek-Turkish coast, a lot of islands, or French coast, no islands. And for this we were asking industry simply to develop sensor configurations, typical sensor, state-of-the-art sensor configurations, and the whole workflow for no threat, low threat, and high threat. So this is the approach we have chosen, and then this, together with a cost estimation tool, should be given at the disposal of the member states. But maybe this we still have to see. This could also maybe be transformed into some kind of minimum technical requirements. It's simply to streamline border surveillance, but to do it in an indirect way. We're also working on a management concept for Eurosur now, but this is still we are still fully in the drafting. What is very important, as I said, is cooperation with third countries. There is one very successful cooperation set up by Spain and Portugal with some Western African countries. The question is, of course, on the one hand you could say, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, that we prevent people from applying for asylum, but you could also say when you prevent them from going into the boats, you're probably saving their lives. It's not all black and white here, but maybe we keep this for the discussion. Phase 2, we are using the 7th Framework Program for Research and Development. There, since 2007-2008, there's quite considerable funding available, 1.4 billion euros for space and 1.4 billion euros for security, and theoretically up to 25% of this could go to border security. Unfortunately now my colleagues from DG Enterprise have already a bit over-programmed now all this, but research is very important here. Step 5, common application of surveillance tools. There we are back to satellites. I will say some more, where Frontex could be a facilitator. For instance, a national coordination center wants to have satellite imagery over a certain area. There's intelligence that boats are leaving between 6 and 9 o'clock in the morning from the coast of Libya between village A and village B, so that the satellites are flying over there to take pictures. That's one possibility. And then step 6, common pre-frontier intelligence picture. We are also working here on a technical concept. We are pretty far with this. The idea is simply to gather intelligence, well, practically worldwide, on possible threats which are approaching the EU external borders. For instance, a case which has happened, a North Korean vessel coming from Dhaka, Bangladesh, with 150 illegal immigrants hidden on board. It was intercepted because the intelligence was there at Canary Islands by the Spanish Navy. So simply here to have information when there is also, let's say, 5 tons of cocaine hidden on a container ship and so on. So here also that should be done with Frontex. So again, as I mentioned, what has been achieved, we are programming the FP7. We have elaborated a concept for the use of satellites, and we are also elaborating currently a concept on the common pre-frontier intelligence picture. So, yes, phase 3, there will be a communication, I said, tomorrow. We have split this into 2 parts. First, focusing on border security, internal security, what you find down here, and the southern maritime borders. And then the idea, this maritime surveillance is of course not only of interest for border control, it's of interest for defense, for transport and so on, to bring this all together into one common platform. And this is just, it looks much more simple than it is. There are very heated discussions going on inside the Council, inside the Commission, simply to bring the three pillars together in the maritime domain by creating this common information sharing environment for the EU maritime domain. There is a bit of a power struggle going on right now, who will take the political lead. But we think that about 70% of, or even more of the activities in the maritime domain are civilian, related to law enforcement and not to the military. That's so to say why we should have a European and civilian solution here. I'm hitting it, I'm a bit side hitting now on NATO, which is very active with Active Endeavour here, which has set up a lot of systems already in this regard. Look, when we look at it in a bit different angle again, and I'm coming slowly to the end, I hope I don't talk too long. This is just more the operational scenario. So we start, in fact, with the common pre-frontier intelligence picture. You see here the different national coordination centers interconnected with each other in the secure communication network, also cooperating with Frontex, and Frontex is going to manage this pre-frontier intelligence picture. Human intelligence, and this was very important for member states, like from embassies, consulates, immigration liaison officers, airport liaison officers, and so on, that would go to Frontex only via the national coordination centers. Member states do not want Frontex to have a direct contact, let's say, with the Spanish immigration liaison officer post in Mauritania. And then on the other hand, we have, here more on the left side, the imagery intelligence. So UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, satellites being operated by Frontex in the future, or in cooperation with the EU Satellite Center or other bodies. However, satellites, frankly speaking, they are pretty useless. When you always think you have these Hollywood movies in your mind, you say, there is, I don't know, an agent running around and saying, I need a satellite imagery, and 5 minutes later he has it on his watch. It's not working like this, and it will never work like this. There is a very limited number of satellites up there. The Earth observation satellites are always orbiting, so they are just coming, they take a picture, then they need to pass by a ground station to download the picture, then it has to be analyzed. So from having the picture taken, it takes usually some hours until the picture is available, but it also takes even longer period of time for the so-called tasking. So you have, in fact, you have to program the satellite in advance. And then, because there are only a limited number of satellites, there's some kind of competition already going on, who is going to program it. So it's not like in movies, it's a rather expensive tool. I was very surprised, in fact, also industry is always telling us the opposite, but what they can really do is not that much. The problem with unmanned aerial vehicles is that they are not allowed to fly in civil airspace, because in case a plane is coming, the UAV doesn't see it, so there might be an accident. That's why in air traffic management they're not allowed to fly. What you can do is to make a segregated airspace where the military then is operating this UAV, but of course you cannot do this all the time. So this will also take probably till 2015, I think that's a positive estimate, to have UAVs, to have all the relevant collision sensors on UAVs, that you can have them, so to say, communicating with other planes. So technology is a tool, but it is not as efficient as it looks in Hollywood movies or as industry would like to make us believe. So what is more important is coming back to the human factor, to the cooperation between different border guards and law enforcement agencies. And there we have the national coordination centers, we have the national surveillance systems, and as part of this, there should be a national situational picture in each of the national coordination centers, which is simply shared between all the national authorities. So they have situational awareness of what is going on at their borders. They know where their patrols are, because this is today not always the case. And they can better coordinate. So when you look up there on the right up corner, let's say this is the Ukrainian Polish-Slovak border. Slovakia has set up quite a sophisticated border surveillance system recently, and in fact the attempts to cross this border were really going down. But it doesn't really help much in the maritime domain. You see here a ship on the top, on the bottom, in the EU maritime domain, let's say the Mediterranean, and we know, based on intelligence, there's something wrong with this ship. What we have agreed so far is that this situational picture should be exchanged between member states with regard to the neighboring border sections. So it means that, back to the Italians and the French in the Mediterranean, they can see each other's alarms. They should see in the future, they cannot do it yet, each other's positioning of patrols. This might help a lot at the land borders, so nobody can take advantage to slip through the Slovak and the Polish border guards. But it might not really help so much in the Mediterranean, where you go into territorial waters, you go back into the high seas, into territorial waters and so on. There's a lot of traffic in the maritime domain, so the ship might get easily lost. And that's why we need this phase 3 of Eurosur, where we have not only the intelligence cooperation between the national coordination centers, but where we take advantage of all ship reporting systems which are available. There's one ship reporting system which was set up only for fishery boats. There's another ship reporting system which was set up for ships, commercial ships above 300 tons, and so on and so on. And this information, in fact, should be brought together. Then it will be much easier simply to track this suspicious vessel. To see, for instance, I mentioned this North Korean boat before, which had the name Happy Days, and which was, while coming from, passing by via Canary Islands, it was pretending to go to Odessa in the Black Sea, of course having other intentions. So then it would be much easier to pursue such a boat, which also what happens now that could easily be a so-called mothership, which means it has these immigrants on board, but it has also small boats on board, would, so to say, leave them off the boat at the Sicilian coast, and then these people in the small boats would pretend to come from the Libyan coast. We had already cases like this too. So this is more technical again, but this is just that we have different information layers. We have then all these stovepipes, these different sectoral systems, and we simply make we do not create one big system, but we make the connections between the different systems. There's a system called Safe SeaNet, which is developed by the transport community. There's system VMS is for fisheries, Eurosur for law enforcement, PT Masu is for defense, and we just make the connections between the different systems. And finally, last slide, we hope we will not end up that's a bit of making fun of the US SBINet, the Secure Border Initiative network between the Mexican and US border, where the Department for Homeland Security has given a huge contract, still under the Bush administration, to Boeing for several billions of euros, and in fact the costs are just going up. We had an iron curtain once. So while this Eurosur sounds maybe in this presentation as a very defensive system, in fact it's not. It's a very flexible system. I'm always fighting with industry. It's absolutely not needed to survey every meter or every kilometer of the external border. What is important is risk analysis, is intelligence, and we do not want to end up with such a wall again, which we had already once. Thank you very much.
thank you, Olivier, for this very interesting presentation. Thank you, Serge, for the very generous introduction that you made. Now, I just want to point out one thing before I start off. The talk I'm going to give has benefited enormously from the research that's been conducted with the P7 ENAC program that Serge mentioned. He was modest enough not to mention that he's a big part of it. And so are the DBO and another colleague of mine, Francesco Ragazzi, working in Paris together. And although the ultimate responsibility for what I'm going to say is mine, I owe a lot to the research that we've done together. So, I was actually asked to concentrate on the question of the ethical and legal challenges of European border control systems. Thanks to Oliver, you've got a pretty good overview of Eurosur and what it's supposed actually to do. I'm going to shift a bit that part that I had more or less anyway cancelled out from my presentation. There's one thing actually I wanted to mention. The Eurosur proposal was initially part of a broader border package that was proposed by the European Commission in February 2008. There's actually 3 communications in that. One of them is an evaluation of Frontex. One of them is the Eurosur proposal. And third one is about next steps in border management systems, which actually proposes 3 additional systems of exchange of information on top of Eurosur. But I will come back to that later. But it's important to understand that context to actually see what are the stakes around Eurosur. Now, the first point I wanted to go through as an introduction was actually on the question of ethics and of ethical investigation in the social sciences. Now, ethics is becoming a very fashionable term. You see a lot of projects, especially in the European funded research schemes, that are now dealing with ethics, especially in relations to technical systems and the way they are used in security policies. But to some extent, ethics is a problematic angle because it's, especially for the social sciences, because it's about developing a normative questioning. It's about asking what ought to be done. And in this sense, running an ethical investigation is about making judgments and making judgments about the difference between what is being done and what ought to be done. It's quite delicate for a number of reasons, mainly because, well, it's kind of hard to develop adequate ethical coordinates within which we can locate the practices that we're observing. And it's also difficult in terms of reflexivity coming to the social sciences. It's the problem of where am I speaking from and how qualified am I to make a judgment, and is that judgment not problematic in the sense that it might actually be construed as a justification for orientations that I as a researcher consider as problematic. That's the problem of ethical investigation. But what I want to try and do tonight is actually to show that there might be another way of doing this, and that is, instead of focusing on the difference between what is done and what ought to be done, that it might be more interesting to look at what is being said about what to be done. In other words, to look at ethics as a specific social practice that has to do with the production and the interpretation of norms. And in that sense, what I wanted to argue in this talk was that European border control and surveillance practices are actually not unethical. They're actually underpinned by a specific ethical system, a specific norm system, which can be articulated in a series of 4 of what I call watchwords. Actually, watchwords was an attempt that I made to translate a French expression, which is mot d'ordre. And mot d'ordre is actually a bit more precise than watchwords, because literally mot d'ordre means words that order. And the watchwords I'm going to talk about are words that actually organize, regulate, and regulate one thing, which is freedom, which is something that actually is quite absent from the border package communication where Eurosur was initially proposed. But they organize freedom not so much by negating it, they do so by breaking it down into several components. I want you to keep that in mind as I go through the presentation. And by breaking it down, they establish the basis for a conceptual slip. That is basically putting freedom into the background and bringing forward different concepts to talk about freedom. So these watchwords, I've singled out 4. I think there could be a few more, but for the sake of concision, we could only talk about these 4. So the 4 are protection, mobility, technology, and anticipation. I've separated them for the sake of clarity, But as I will try to show, there's actually quite a considerable degree of interplay between them. Now, the first watchword is protection. And now we've seen that protection of European citizens from dangers and threats has become a central tenet of the EU's area of freedom, security and justice policies. Europe that protects, that's actually one of the titles of the Commission's recent proposals for the Stockholm program. And the problem with that is that at some point we overlook what actually protection means. So what is it protection? And if you allow me, I'm going to go into a bit of etymology here. Just to specify that if you look at protection, protection is actually a relation. It's a three-way relation. It's a relation between the protector, the enemy, and the protected. So that's three components of that relation. And if you go to the etymology of what protection is, you actually find three origins. So my apologies for my Latin, which is really execrable, but anyway. The first meaning is protection as tegere or protegere. And that designates the action of covering, of shielding, of protecting someone with a shield. So in the sense, tegere has to do with the protection of the body, whether it is an individual body or a collective body, a nation. But in protection as tegere, what is interesting is that there's often the protected and the protector are often the same person, or in the case where they're not, the protected is actually sovereign in his decision and takes a contract with the protector. And there is also in tegere a dual confrontation. You have the protector protected, and you have the enemy, and there's a clash. That's tegere. The second etymology of protection is protection as presidere. In that sense, presidere means to protect and supervise at the same time. It means to chair and to have precedence over. And compared to tegere, what's interesting is that presidere places the emphasis on the relation between the protector and the protected. And in that sense, you have to see that in presidere, the protected becomes more passive. That is, he's supervised, he's monitored by the protector. And in this sense, presidere relates to disciplinary techniques such as fortress, the camp, or even the prison. The last etymology of protection is protection as tutore. That is to look after with care. So the protected in tutore is actually considered as irresponsible, childlike. He's being taken care of with lots of love by the protector, but that means that he's also placed under increased monitoring by a state, which is contained by a territory, which is enclosed by borders. That's the typical understanding of protection in presidere. Tutore, it's a bit more complex because it's about monitoring of the present and the future. It's about the channeling of the protected alongside established corridors. And in that sense, in the medieval period, typically tutore was about distinguishing between sacred and profane places, that you could claim asylum in sacred places regardless of what you had done. But you were also channeled around these sacred places because as sacred they were sometimes taboo. If you talk in contemporary terms, tutore actually would include databases, data mining, profiling. Populations are channeled along specific corridors, sorted out, policed upstream but also downstream. Now, what's the relation with Eurosur there? It's actually a question I asked myself at some point. What is interesting with Eurosur that the proposal, I think as Oliver showed pretty well, it conveys the semantics of protection as presidere. That is, the establishment of a crustacean-like border, controlled and watched by means of entirely computerized system. At the same time, and as Oliver showed it again, Eurosur places significant emphasis on risk analysis, on profiling, on placing the close proximities of the EU under surveillance, in order to anticipate, I'll come back on anticipation later, to anticipate on threats. So if you reposition Eurosur within the context of the Commission's 2008 border package, it actually reflects a shift, maybe, of European politics of protection from the notion of presidere to the notion of tutore. European citizens, by means, for example, of Eurobarometer surveys, are assumed to be in search of protection, and it is provided to them with care, acting upon the present but also on the future. So there's a corollary to that shift, and this is for some time now. We have seen claims that security, as such, is a right. It's the right to be protected from dangers and from threats. But security as a right to be protected has actually two implications. In particular, it has the implication that if you say that security is a right, that means that it's equivalent to other rights, so civil rights, fundamental liberties. So in that sense, that means that perhaps you have a balance between security and liberty. But again, there's a couple of problems with that metaphor. First of all, it always plays out in favor of security. For some reason, which I actually can't fathom, in our liberal regimes, we consider that liberties are always guaranteed, and therefore that they can be sacrificed in favor of security. So that's the first problem. The second problem is actually the legal status of the right to security. Now, I'm not a lawyer at all, but I know something that is called the right to safety, in French, sûreté. The right to safety is different from security, in the right to security, because it includes the notion that persons have the right to be protected from the abuses of the state. And that's the habeas corpus, for example, in the UK. So this, the shift towards tutorial has that implication of starting to hear about security as a right, whereas legally speaking it's a bit contestable. So that was for protection. Protection as tutorial, and protection as with the right to security as a corollary. The second watchword I wanted to talk about was mobility. And it's a bit strange actually to have to talk about mobility in a discussion about European border control and surveillance. But actually, there is a lot of emphasis on mobility if you look at EU official documents. There's one extract from the 2008 communication on next steps in border management that I actually wanted to submit to your attention. So the quote goes, the external borders of the EU are crossed every year by more than 300 million travellers, EU citizens and third country nationals combined. This mirrors the importance of EU cultural heritage and the success of its political and socio-economic model. In order to share its values and support economic growth, the EU must remain open and accessible to others. End of quote. Which is actually quite a noteworthy comment. But it has a corollary, again. The openness and accessibility of the EU is to be enjoyed by bona fide travellers, good faith travellers. But good faith here is not assumed. We do not assume that travellers come in good faith. Actually, it must be demonstrated. And if I go back to the new systems that have been proposed by the Commission in the border package, good faith can, for example, be demonstrated by voluntary enrollments into a foreseen registered travel program. Now, enrollment to that program entails, among other things, that you would be screened, that your travel history would be screened in depth, and that you would actually hold a biometric passport. So if you want to come in an easier fashion to the EU, you have to accept a certain degree of screening. So the emphasis on mobility as desirable and imperative has a corollary. That is, that to enjoy mobility, one must agree to an increased degree of screening. It has a specific application in the context of Eurosur, which has to do with the rules governing maritime circulation in the state's territorial waters. Now, this is regulated by the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, which is also called the Montego Bay Convention, which establishes something, and it's quite interesting. It's called the right of innocent passage. That means that a ship is free to travel through a coastal state's territorial waters, so long, and I'm quoting, so long as it is not prejudicial to the peace, good order, or security of the coastal state. So that's fair enough. Increasingly, however, and we've noticed that within the INEX research that we're conducting, maritime safety and security professionals have argued that the right to innocent passage is compatible with the prohibition of anonymous passage. In other words, innocent passage is to be demonstrated by compliance with all possible requests for identification by the authorities of the coastal state. So what is at stake in this sense? I think it's clearly the presumption of innocence, that mobility is desirable. Mobility, however, to occur must entail additional screening. And so what you're seeing is actually the generalization of suspicion of all the persons on the move, including actually EU citizens to some extent. I had another element to emphasize, but I'm going to skip it for now. It's the question actually of the substitution between freedom of movement and speed in the context of mobility. But we'll come back to that in the questions if you want to. The third watchword that I mentioned is technology. Now, in the past few years, technology has become a major focus of European security policies, especially security research, which has become an important item of EU research and development. Firstly, that was through the preparatory action on security research that ran between 2004 and 2006, and was endowed with a community budget of 45 million euros. Secondly, now with the current FP7, where you have a dedicated security team, which is endowed with 1.4 billion euros. Now, there's a series of questions to be raised about technology without actually being alluded at. When you look at documents, EU documents, technology is often presented as a force enabler. However, to some extent I'd argue it's actually looked at more as a panacea. And here's one extract from the report of 2004 by the Group of Personalities on Security Research, which was convened by the European Commission, DG Enterprise and DG Research at the time. So the quote goes, "Technology itself cannot guarantee security, but security without the support of technology is impossible. It provides us with information about threats, helps us to build effective protection against them, and, if necessary, enables us to neutralize them." So there's some kind of technological imagination at work here. And it's actually quite ambiguous because it's quite a complex symbolic economy. On the one hand, you have some kind of techno-fetishism. Security is impossible without technology. On the other hand, there's a profound uneasiness with technology, but not where we would expect it. It's an uneasiness fueled by the image of sophisticated technology being used by the wrong persons, which is incidentally something that has not really occurred so far. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. So technology as panacea, that's the first aspect. The second ethical construction that is associated to technology is technology as progress. Now, this is the one aspect of this is that technology is almost systematically framed in terms of efficiency. And for example, I was struck in the Eurosur proposal, but after hearing Oliver's talk, I think I understand it a bit more. There is no real assessment of possible weaknesses in the context of such a large transnational system, or, for example, possible structural breaches that can occur in conditions of intensive use. And this is something that actually came up with the SIS2 system, where at some point there was actually a realization that if the system was to be used at full speed by the maximum number of users, then the security of the data was compromised. So this is an example of this. So technology embraced as panacea and as progress as a corollary. And here I'm going to refer to another document, which actually is the final result of an action that was undertaken within the European Commission's PASR. It's called the European Security High-Level Study on Terrorism Responses and Relevant Technologies. It was a consortium composed by the Crisis Management Initiative, the International Institute for Security Studies, and Thales. And the quote I want to submit to you is actually in the discussion of the impact of security technologies on fundamental freedoms and rights. And the quote goes, "Another factor to be taken into consideration is the related efficiency of technologies. For example, facial recognition systems at present are very unreliable. The choice of technologies will become political and ethical if it is between efficient but highly privacy invasive systems and less efficient but privacy neutral solutions." End of quote. So here, I think it's worth to make a few comments. First of all, you see again that kind of balance metaphor. Here, it's between efficiency on the one hand, privacy on the other. And secondly, the assumption that is behind this view is that intrusiveness is a requirement for efficiency, and that privacy actually undermines efficiency, thus enhancing potential insecurities. So in other words, the idea is that technology itself embodies efficiency, progress, it's neutral as such, and it's only hindered by ethical and political considerations. The bottom line I think I want to bring up here is actually a question, which is, can computers be biased? And so is technology neutral, and can computers be biased? But in the view that I've sketched out, there's actually no room for this question. Technology is efficient, period. Its degree of efficiency is modulated by ethical and political decision, period. But actually, technology, maybe I'm a bit too much of a social scientist here, but technology is not only about technical objects. Technology is a human activity, and it's including in the way in which technical objects are designed and they're operated. But if you frame discussions about technology only in terms of efficiency, the whole debate shifts from the political desirability of technology to the balancing of efficiency and ethical considerations. So this is, I think, another element of problematization we should bring up. So as far as technology is concerned, if you allow me to sum it up, is technology is panacea, technology is progress, and therefore technology framed as neutral and accordingly in terms of efficiency. Moving on to the third word, to the fourth actually. The fourth is anticipation. And that's a very tricky one. Anticipation has been a major component in the Eurosur proposal. The main purpose of the system is, quote, to recognize patterns and analyze trends, supporting the detection of migration routes and the prediction of risks, end of quote. in order, quote again, to compose a common pre-frontier intelligence picture. Again, end of quote. So, anticipation, you can find it Eurosur proposal, has also become a broader element of the dominant view informing EU security policies. And it has percolated in particular through the spread of risk management practices within the both EU level and national level security services and agencies. The problem with anticipation, again, is that if it's generalized, it becomes the problem becomes problematic, of course, but if it's generalized, it raises a series of questions. Now, anticipation can be broken down in 3 components, and that's something that we've surveyed in the next program. First element of anticipation is proactivity. Proactivity involves the activity of following traces, in particularly electronic ones, led by individuals or groups, which are the target of surveillance. Proactivity can be territorially focused, but most often it concentrates on populations and movements of populations. The second element of anticipation is profiling. So, profiling is a technique through which data gathered through surveillance is integrated into a predetermined analytical framework, which is expected to produce an image of the present, but also to allow for building scenarios of future trends, and that's called risk analysis, threat assessment. Profiling as a policing technique takes security practices beyond the realm of criminal justice. Criminal justice is about investigating. If you include the whole element of profiling and anticipation, then you're leaning towards the prediction of the future and what is going to happen. And the popular reference in this case is Philip K. Dick's novel Minority Report, which was turned into a brilliant movie with Tom Cruise. The third element of anticipation is prevention. Now, prevention is the ultimate goal of proactivity and profiling. The idea of prevention is actually not to recover from an event or to respond to it, not even to be protected by it, but actually to assess a future threat and to prevent the event from happening itself. So that's the third component, prevention. And in that sense, if you look at these 3 components, anticipation poses kind of a thorny ethical dilemma. I think we would all agree that it's kind of sound thinking that you would try to prevent something bad from happening. I think that's fairly logical. The problem is that there's a difference between anticipation when a threat has been identified and is known, from anticipation in order to identify a threat, or rather from anticipation in order to discover threats. In the later case, in the case where this second aspect of anticipation is generalized, which appears to be the case as far as the EU is concerned, you have a shift from investigation to detection. And that, here we find ourselves again confronted with the question of innocence and suspicion. So if you generalize detection, that means that everybody is potentially a suspect. That means that you're turning from what you could call passive trust in people who want, say, to enter into the European Union, to a logic of active mistrust, that all individuals are potentially criminals, illegal migrants. I may be forcing the argument a bit here, but as a trend, that's where it actually points out. So this is quite a problem. And of course, the last issue of anticipation is that ultimately you never know the future. Regardless of how many algorithms you use and how many computers you put in a network, you don't know, you cannot know what the future holds for you. So, I've been talking really fast, I realize, but I want to bring it a bit together now. I've highlighted a series of 4 watchwords, which, in my view, underwrite European border control and surveillance practices. Now, I've separated these watchwords, but to some extent, they actually play to each other. Protection into technology, technology into mobility, mobility into anticipation, anticipation into protection, and so on. And you can connect them in any number of ways. So they play into each other. But they also share something that would be a common operational reach from a more, I say, philosophical point of view. They all constitute, to some extent, an operation on freedom. How is it that they operate? The idea is that they operate on freedom not by negating it, which is the typical argument that you hear about people criticizing Fortress Europe. Fortress Europe is the negation of rights. But that's not what's happening there. It's just that these ethical watchwords are actually breaking down the notion of freedom into several components. Freedom is protection, freedom is mobility, freedom is technological progress, freedom as anticipation. So these are ethical components, and again, their operation is not to negate security, but actually to negate freedom, but to operate on freedom. And that maybe, I think, is the most stringent ethical challenge that we're confronted with today. It's not to say that European border control and surveillance practices are unethical. It's actually to find a way out of an ethical deadlocks between two sets of conflicting ethical principles. That being said, I'm just going to move on to more specific challenges that are being raised by the Eurosur proposal. I think, actually, I think we would agree with Oliver on that. One of the first questions actually raised by the form of the proposal itself. That is, Eurosur is not a proposal for legislation. Eurosur is actually a prospective proposal. As you heard, it's most of the systems that could be integrated within the system are actually not existing. The most advanced one is the French Spationav system. You have the Spanish SIVE system. Now the Civic system, the Portuguese one, has come online recently. So the system is not, the Eurosur proposal is not about integrating something that already exists. It's actually a research and development initiative. And one of its main outcomes has been the launching of a demonstration program now, which we talked about before the conference, which has a relatively minor endowment. It's only 13 million euros, but still. In this sense, the problem is with the procedure. That the Eurosur proposal contains very little in terms of legislation, actually no proposal for legislation at all. It's an exercise in technical integration or integration of technical systems. But this has an implication. It means that the authorities who might be consulted in the case of a legislative proposal, and I'm thinking of the European Parliament and of the European Data Protection Supervisors, are effectively circumvented and have no say in what Eurosur is doing. So, moving on to questions raised by contents. I think we're going to have a discussion about this later. A question raised by contents of the Eurosur proposal. The first question, in my view, is digital proliferation. As I said, the border package of 2008 contains 4 proposed database and information exchange systems. In addition to the 2 main systems currently being developed, the Schengen Information System 2 and the Visa Information System. So there's a question, I think, of proportionality here. Since we don't know, since the SIS2 and the VIS are not actually operational now, are there any need for more of these systems? Do we need more than what is already existing or about to exist? Secondly, there's the issue of operability and interoperability. Can these systems actually function? Typically, for the Eurosur system, I think it's more of a trial and error kind of process. And this is problematic because if you look at it from the outside, which I would desperately try to do, you actually have very few in terms of information on the feasibility of the system. You have 2 studies on which the Eurosur proposal is based. One undertaken in 2003 by a subcontractor of the French Ministry of Interior, which is a consultancy called Civipol Conseil, and one undertaken by Frontex itself, which is Bortec. Now, the first study does not contain much in the way of technical details, and the second one, I don't know because it's only partially available. And I've asked Frontex any number of times for the full report, never got it. So that's the first issue, digital proliferation. Second issue, question of the continuum of threats. The prime purpose of Eurosur is fairly unambiguous, as Oliver showed, is the reduction in the number of illegal immigrants who manage to enter the EU undetected. However, the communication also says that it would serve to increase internal security of the EU as a whole by contributing to the prevention of cross-border crime, the prevention of terrorism, trafficking in human beings, drug smuggling, illicit arms trafficking, etc. End of quote. And also to enhance search and rescue capacity to reduce the number of deaths at sea at the EU borders. Now, there's several problems here. First question is the issue of purpose. How is Eurosur exactly supposed to increase internal security? For example, how does it contribute to the prevention of terrorism? There's a corollary interrogation here, which is that if it is contributing to countering terrorism, then what does it mean for the authorities that will have access to it? Does that mean that beyond border guards, you will also have intelligence agencies who will be able to access the system? So that's another question. Second problem is a more, say, a larger problem. It's the question of the transfer of illegitimacy. If you associate systematically migrants, traffickers, and terrorists, then the result is that you obfuscate the specific issues that are linked to persons that are on the move. And especially, and we've already mentioned this, the question that these persons might actually be eligible for asylum. So there's another issue there. The third question, I think, is the question of remit creep. And this concerns in particular Frontex. Now, Frontex features quite highly in the Eurosur proposal, as it will have, as far as I understand it, as a border intelligence coordination center. And this would shift the focus of the agency from what it's doing at the moment, mostly operational coordination, to some kind of an intelligence agency. But again, the question is, how do you amend the Frontex regulation to take this into account? And this, I actually haven't found it, nor in the evaluation of Frontex or in the Eurosur communication. Which leads me actually to another issue, which was when I started working on Frontex a couple of years ago. I remember having an interview with official X, who was telling me, no, there's no problem. Frontex will never have to handle personal data, because it does not need to have that. 2008, I read the Eurosur proposal and I see, well, the system might be called up to handle personal data, which means that Frontex will have access to it. And again, what's the framework for regulating this? Where is the change in the regulation? So this is pretty much an unanswered question. Which leads me to issues related to data protection, and here I'm going to be very modest because I have Serge and Laura in the room, so I will try to remain as focused as possible. Now clearly the Eurosur system, even if it's only a system of systems, will be a data-intensive system. Several reasons. Multiple input and access possibilities, real-time circulation of information, and possibility that the system would handle personal information. And then of course, here you have the whole range of questions that are tied to data protection, legitimacy, proportionality, purposefulness, transparency, security of data, quality of the data. All of these questions need to be asked. And the problem is that data protection is not inbuilt in the design of Eurosur. And there's only that the communication also just mentioned at some point that there might be data protection issues involved, and that those should be taken into account according to EU national legislation. Well, there are not that many large-scale systems in existence in the EU. And actually I'm drawing this from the EDPS's comments on the border package, where he actually points out one interesting thing, which is that the layered supervision model that has been put in place for the SIS2 and VIS systems has actually had no time to develop. So we don't know what are the implications and what are the challenges linked with data protection in these major transnational systems. Which returns to my earlier point about the proliferation of about digital proliferation. Finally, yes, we're getting to the end of it. Beyond these very specific challenges, I think there's a number of indirect questions, and that has to do with both pushing back the borders and pushing back the persons. As I said, Eurosur is focusing on the EU borders, but if it operates the way it's supposed to operate, it would actually shift border controls much beyond the formal borders of the EU. It would actually push them into the high seas and also into third countries. Now, there's a number of issues about this. One of them is cooperation with third countries, which is, will that entail exchanges of information? In that case, what's the legal framework for that? Even if this information is exchanged on an informal basis via a phone call, there's still an issue there. And there's also the question of pushing back the people. That is, if Eurosur operates as according to plans, it would exacerbate something that is already problematic insofar as EU border control practices are concerned. That is that increasingly, persons who want to travel to the EU encounter controls before they reach EU territory, and very often before they actually leave the country. This is the whole visa system. That's how it actually works. So, of course, on the one hand, you would argue that there's a humanitarian impetus behind Eurosur, which is, well, we need to prevent deaths at sea. And here I will ask you to rethink what I said about protection as futore, actually. But the question of pushing back the persons is that clearly those who would be eligible for asylum cannot launch the claim. And Frontex is actually getting into a lot of trouble over this issue for the past few months. So pushing back borders and pushing back persons, I think that's maybe a more indirect question, but one that is worthy of being raised. Conclusions. So I mentioned that idea that rather than being confronted to unethical practices, we're confronted with an ethical deadlock between two sets of conflicting practices, at least. Is there a way out of it? I wish I had the answer. If I had it, I would not be a PhD student anymore, and I would be a consultant for the European Commission. But for the time being, it's a very difficult question to answer. One thing that we need to keep in mind, and actually I think is forgotten, at least by the EU institution, is that ethical components such as data protection, freedom of movement, so on and so forth, they should not only be maintained, and that's actually stated in the Commission's proposal for the Stockholm Programme, that civil liberties and fundamental freedoms should be maintained. But no, they actually have to be upheld, they have to be renovated, they have to be re-engineered, especially in the view of evolving security and surveillance practices. And that's something that's, I think, quite often forgotten. And finally, if you will allow me, Serge, to go back to the title of the lecture series, Europe under Threat. When I saw the title, I must admit I was a bit reluctant, because even with the interrogation mark, I thought it was a bit too strong. But then we had to talk, and so now I understand the point. But the question here is, which Europe is under threat, and what is it under threat from? One aspect of the Eurosur proposal that is quite problematic, I think, is that it places emphasis on technical integration. And the fact that, and the problem is that this technical integration is conducted without new legislation. Okay, this might be a red tape effect. But it also raises the question concerning the outlook of contemporary European construction. With projects like Eurosur, and I think Eurosur is not the only one in this case, political meaning of European construction, and particularly its meaning for EU citizens and other persons alike, appears to be lost. The main political achievement of European construction has been to say, well, if you're a European citizen, and even if you're not, but you're in the EU, you can pretty much move around as you wish, and you can get settled in other countries. In a nutshell, it's more complicated than that, and certainly more problematic than that. That's the idea. That's a true achievement. However, what happens when we replace political construction by technical integration? That's a question, and that might actually be in this sense that Europe is under threat. Thank you.
Well, actually, you are excellent speakers for a chair, because I think that Julien addressed at least 50 questions to Oliver. So first thing I'm going to do is to give the floor to Oliver. But since we still have 20 minutes, I would like to leave some space and some room for the audience as well. But please, Oliver, I think you have a number of things to say.
Thank you. Interesting. I thought in the beginning you started very soft, and I thought, come on, that's it. At the end it got more interesting indeed. I'm not talking as European Commission, of course. I'm very much behind you, I admit it. What is the basic idea? The basic idea is to get acceptance for, this maybe in my introduction I didn't make it clear enough, for more legal immigration, which we need, both with the European populations as well as with the migrants. So for the migrants, being a legal immigrant should pay off. It should not be like this, that if you have to wait for 1 or 2 years, but if you come as an illegal immigrant, you are in the EU and you can do it in 2 months. That's the one thing. The other thing is that the acceptance, unfortunately, in the European public for legal immigration is not there. So it's like 2 sides of the coin, or it's like the 2 sides of the moon. There's the sunny side, integration, asylum, need for international protection, what I did for 10 years in my life, which is the relatively nice side. I'm not saying it's easy, it's also very difficult. But then there's, so to say, the dark side, what I'm now dealing with, is simply both sides together, they give migration management. You have to deal with both aspects in order to get people in order to be able to absorb immigration in Europe, in order to integrate them, you have to manage it. And this is a bit the point, that also border control, it is needed, but of course, when we come back, it should be proportionate. And also for me, it's the issue is to find a balanced approach between what we had, let's say, how East German border troops were doing it. They were highly efficient, but you have a police state.
The other possibility is, the other extreme is to open the borders. But with the political situation we have in a number of countries, we have now, like in Italy, illegal immigration becomes a criminal offense. I was preaching for years in the new member states, illegal immigrants are not criminals. Treat them accordingly. Don't treat them like criminals, but treat them in a dignified manner. And this is what can happen easily when politics are not managing illegal immigration. It goes even more to the other extreme by making illegal immigration a criminal offense, by putting people who have not committed a crime, at least in my opinion, up to 18 months now into detention centers, which is a very long period of time. And it can go on. It can even go on that at a certain moment, what happened already, that border guards are allowed to shoot at the border. This should definitely not happen. So it's really to find here balance. It has to be managed, but to find a balance. This is just the thinking I have behind this, and I try to find a balanced approach. You made some quotes from some DG Enterprise papers. Technology is neutral, is efficient, security is not possible, is without technology is impossible. Well, I totally disagree with this approach, because this was written by industry. This is what they always try to tell us, technology is the solution for everything. Of course it's not. Rather the opposite. Facial recognition systems are not working. I have participated in several tests. Industry is always saying 80–90% more. I have been with some colleagues testing it. In my opinion, it's not working. And you mentioned Minority Report. For me, the movies which I have in mind are Brazil and 1984. So I see the responsibility I have, and I take it. And I was always thinking, maybe at the end, it's not an easy job, but it's maybe better I have at least a consciousness about it, and I'm, so to say, full of hate against migrants. There are also people like this. Data protection. Well, we have put in the Eurosur communication, at the end there is a chapter on data protection. In fact, we have put it in just to show that we are aware of the problem. Also, the basic idea was that personal data should not be included in Eurosur. How it will develop now, of course, there is a discussion going on now whether Frontex should handle personal data or not. There's an internal discussion going on. Nobody knows what will be the result for the time being. And it is, I'm a lawyer, it is absolutely an issue to be dealt with. But the idea is that we leave personal data out because it's very sensitive. One could argue, of course, whether the name of a ship is personal data or not. Some people say yes, I would say no. However, I agree that maybe the story is in this regard not over yet. And when we come to the common pre-frontier intelligence picture, of course, intelligence, data, information, data is in fact processed information. So the question is, what is data? Personal data is one thing, but data can also be non-personal. Then quickly, just
a small remark. Yeah. The e-privacy directive protects non-personal data in the same way as personal data, for example, traffic and location data. And would you go that far?
well,
By traffic and location data, I mean in electronic communications, but it could be.
I'm not the personal data expert, but I still see a difference between the personal data of a human being and data with regard to, let's say, a vessel. I mean, there I still see a qualitative difference. I'm not really an expert on this, so I have to admit. Then on the real substantive part, EU borders move from the EU borders to the high seas to third countries. Yes, touché. You got it. This is, I admit, yes, this is, I cannot deny this.
It's even the idea is to see the Mediterranean as one area where we have also with the neighboring third countries common security interests, be it illegal migration, be it drug trafficking, cross-border crime, etc. To be a bit provocative, what is more humanitarian to so to say, make it more difficult for refugees, in the meaning of the Geneva Convention, to come to Europe, or to prevent them from drowning in the sea? But this might maybe sound a bit cynical, but let's go back to the Geneva Convention, because I dealt with it for many years. Geneva Convention is from 1951. When you look at it, I see it was a very wonderful instrument in the Cold War, used by the Western European free countries against the communist countries, where it was very much focusing on individual persecution. What does it mean? When people were coming, for instance, from Bosnia in the 90s to Austria, they have been raped, they have been tortured, they have been put in concentration camps because of being Muslims. I dealt with these people. They were refused because it was not an individual persecution, it was a group persecution. I mean, this is really cynical. So in fact the Geneva Convention doesn't fit our needs. That's why there were concepts coming up like subsidiary protection, temporary protection, but also here the problem is that today we would probably not agree on something so far-reaching like the Geneva Convention anymore. So that's why we still keep it up, because it's still better than what we would have if we would probably renegotiate it. I keep it a bit with Bertolt Brecht. I just try to translate a saying from German. It was, first comes the feeding, then comes the morale. When we have somebody in the middle of Africa, simply starving to death, why should this person not have the right simply to move on, to go to a place where this person can survive, have a decent living? On the other hand, that's very nice in scientific terms, but when we come to political reality, if we would open up the borders, we would have even more in the future, because we are still very rich, when quite many people arriving. So I'm afraid that the liberty we have right now would be, of course this can be criticized as being cynical again, but would be more at stake, and we would lose more of this liberty at the end, because we would, so to say, the right-wing parties would say, well, we have to be even much stricter with these illegal immigrants. So we have to find the balance. I don't really have an answer anyway, and I will never have, and nobody of us will ever have. But it's just to find the right balance here. And you're right, it's some ethical deadlock we are caught here. And I think it's, at the end, it's everything about proportionality, it's about balance, it's about finding this. Last thing, legal basis. Of course there will be a legal basis. But this was maybe a little bit a trick done by the Commission, because it's a very sensitive field for member states. And we were simply saying we wanted first to demonstrate by working together more efficiently that they see the added value. And there, you're right, it's some kind of research aspect here. It's simply demonstrating, also by a number of pilot projects we are going to do, we are doing already, that cooperation between authorities, between different member states, between the civilian side, between the military side, and so pays off. That there has to be a legal basis was clear from the very beginning, and the Commission is planning to table a legal basis probably in 2011 to also clarify all issues, also including personal data protection and so on. But this is something which you will not find in writing somewhere, which I say here, because of course you cannot have cooperation between member states, but also with third countries without a legal basis. So I tried to react a bit, but of course it could be a discussion at least for 2 hours. Thank you.
Turning myself to you now. Not so much time left. Yes. With a loud voice, please, because then you have
I have a question, actually two questions, and maybe it's actually three questions, but never mind. So I'd like to know, so that I could compare, what the costs are, because I have the impression that there's lots of technology used and always more and more that's put forward. So what's the cost, approximately, of course, I don't expect you know exactly. What is the cost or the investment in technology for surveillance and stuff? And I have the impression it's quite a lot because there's new systems and not every year, but every so many years. And also I see that the Eurosur seems to be huge. I mean, it's also, coordinating different points, so that also implies new technology costs to put everyone in communications. And on the other hand, I'm wondering what the costs or what was the investment of the European Union in development when they start countries of origin. Now, why do I ask this question? Is because, well, I see many scholars and I read quite some stuff, and we're always talking about surveillance there, threat, this and that. But I don't think it really goes to the core of the problem. I mean, surveillance and also to be provocative, the Eurosur thing, it's like this huge patchwork. We've got immigrants coming and with them also criminals, etc. But the core question is, why do the people keep coming? And so development tries to answer one of the questions because, of course, somehow we've created poverty in the third world, and we're partly responsible for it. So I just wanted to compare the two investments we're doing.
I would say this is a very large question, but maybe both of you have some reflections about that.
Well, that's exactly the question I would have asked 15 years ago, when I was, so to say, still on the other side. The costs. Industry wants to have a lot of costs. I don't think so. It is, on the one hand, member states are investing in the national surveillance systems anyway. They are anyway up developing. And they are very often unfortunately convinced by industry that they have to surveil every kilometer of the border. We want to get away from this. We come back to risk analysis, intelligence, pre-frontier area, and so on. So their industry totally disagrees with me, but of course they're lobbying at all levels. Then these investments would be done anyway, but if it's done in a coordinated manner, there might be some cost efficiency. Like satellite pictures are currently sold several times. They could be bought once and then made in the system, put at disposal of different services. Of course it will cost something, but this is anyway under the External Border Fund, between 50 and 75% the EU is funding. For Eurosur it's 75%. This money would be spent anyway, which of course is a bit of a weak argument when you say, because it still costs you taxpayers money. But as I said, the main element of Eurosur is not to what industry still thinks, to create a lot, hundreds of millions or billions of euros of investments, but simply to bring different authorities in member states together, interagency cooperation between member states. That's the idea behind it. Development aid. I'm not so convinced about development aid. I think I took out this slide, but when you look at the beginning, when you look at this UN report, the remittances sent by migrants back to their countries is already much higher than development aid. And I was also very interested in this topic for a while, and I think development aid was quite often making more damage than really bringing something. I think what really helps is economic development, is education. And I was traveling to Africa. I've been traveling to China several times in the beginning of the 90s, now again, and I was amazed in China by all the criticism about human rights. We are very good about this in Europe, but what they managed is within 15 years' time, when I had been there, hundreds of millions of people have a better life. This was clearly visible even to me, traveling all in the cities, but also in the countryside. So I think this development aid is still very much from an old Western concept where we come with our human rights. We always tell other people how they should do it. I think they should rather know themselves how to do it. And, it's like this Chinese proverb is don't provide the fish, just show how to catch the fish. I think that's a bit. And on the other hand, if we would, so to say, Africa, if we would say, which is closest to us and which will be more and more becoming our problem in the coming years, we simply do not have the financial resources to help the whole of Africa. We don't have it. And we had a good time in Europe for a number of hundreds of years, but it's coming to an end. And we will see that we will not become richer anymore, it will rather be the opposite. So what I think what will rather happen in the coming decades, I'm now being pessimistic, is that we will become less and less attractive, because we will not be so rich anymore in comparison to them. But that's a rather pessimistic comment. So why people are coming, I think it's very simple. They just don't see a perspective at home. And I think it's what I noticed when I dealt with these migrants. It's not so much what are the real conditions at home. It's rather what in their perception, how they see their future. And if they don't see a good possibility, then they simply leave. Even more on subjective grounds than maybe on objective ones. But now I'm becoming a bit philosophical. I tried to answer a bit, but I can also, frankly speaking, I don't have all the answers.
Just on the cost, I think we both mentioned the cost for the demonstration program is 30 million euros in community contribution. If you're talking about security research at large in the EU, it's 44.5 million for the former preparatory action, and the budget of the FP7 security theme is 1.4 billion euros, and that's about 4% of the FP7's cooperation theme, which is the largest chunk in the FP7 overall endowment. So, and on the whole issue of development migration, the last report of the UNDP might be interesting for you, because it's basically on migration and development, and it's actually quite surprising when you read some of their coming from the UNDP. It's quite surprising.
Maybe if I just may add on the FP7, this is an industry-driven program. The money is there anyway, it would be spent anyway. We try to make the best out of it, but these demonstration projects, whatever, I mean, I'm from the policy DG, and we are policy-driven. This is industry-driven, so they program sometimes things which are not bad, but which will probably not be used exactly the way they intend to.
Well,
I hope I was careful enough on it.
Well, that makes me think about the fact that I'm participating to quite some FP7 projects.
Sorry.
Okay, well, I see that it is 8 o'clock. It's too 8 o'clock, so I would like to thank the two speakers very much for their very interesting presentations. And, well, you've been a good public, even if you didn't have the many occasions to ask questions. But anyway, thanks a lot, and see you next week, I hope.